presentation is about comics translation. So is it difficult to translate them? You must decide for yourself. So normally, since all of you are into translation studies, you must know that different fields of translation require different translation techniques and different approaches and methods. So there is a certain specifics of this kind of translation, which I would like to tell you about. And actually, when I did my yesterday's research, it turned out that translating comics is quite popular now. Even though I was aware that there are a lot of translation teams worldwide, like some of them translate from Chinese, Japanese into English, and I even follow one of these translation teams. And I myself am a member of the Ukrainian translation team, Шлякбитраф. So we work on a comics which is called Outsider, and there are like 4 of us in this team that works especially on the comics. Let's switch to the definition of a comic. So a comic, and in plural comics, is also known as a comic strip, and it is a narrative form that combines written text and pictures. So a comic consists of a series of interrelated pictures and text. Sometimes people mistakenly say comics when they mean just one thing, but it is not grammatically correct, as it turned out yesterday. Even though in Ukrainian we say comics, in English the singular form is comic. Now about the specifics and difficulties of comics translation. So it was not mentioned anywhere, but I would like to include it into my list. And the difficulty number 1 is group work. Since usually when you translate a comic, you work in groups, or maybe even in a very big company sometimes. And there are some disputes and controversies and different kinds of situations when you just cannot come to a consensus with your group mates, and it's very hard to decide which version of translation is better. So this was kind of hard for me. Because I think it's clear why. Then the difficulty number 2 is limited space. As you know, the page of a comic looks like a page filled with bubbles, speech bubbles, and they are limited. So when the original author of a comic puts the words into the speech bubble, it is clear that he doesn't think about increasing the space in the case the translation might take more space. He just does the work the way he wants to, and thus when we translate, sometimes the words just cannot fit into the speech bubble. And so it's important to fix the font size, but sometimes fixing the font size is not enough because you cannot make it very small, actually. And this is why sometimes we have to eliminate text from the speech bubbles. And this is usually very discouraging and I would say even devastating to translators, because sometimes we must simply eliminate the accessory content, but there are cases when really important things and facts must be deleted because they just don't seem to fit into the speech bubble. And well, that makes us very sad. But there's no other way out, actually. We simply must think of ways to make the translation more concise without losing some meaning. So now, well, I would like to show you some examples that include different translation techniques, I'd say. Not just the ones that were mentioned just now, but some other too. For example, this part, it had to be the page translated by me, but still, I received help from my group mates because this one was too hard. So, this is a special space comic about the galactic war. And that's why there is a special trade language that the characters speak, and it is like a fake language, actually. So the author uses different unknown words typed in Latin, like passadia, tanaso, and so on and so forth. And that's like a difficulty for a translator, because when we think of what to do with this, it's not quite clear whether we should preserve it in English letters or transliterate it into Ukrainian letters or just delete it. So we decided to just preserve the English letters. And besides, there is another case here. I'm not sure whether you've heard or not. There is a popular song. I think it was called Space Oddity. And it goes, major tone to ground control. I'm floating in the most peculiar way, and the stars look very different today. Planet Earth is blue, and there is nothing I can do. Well, it's clear that, once again, we must find a way to preserve the sense, but not just translate, but find an equivalent in the Ukrainian language. So my proposal was to use the song Земля в иллюминаторе, but it's not Ukrainian actually, so we decided on Дивлюся на небо і думку гадаю, чому я не сокіл, чому не літаю, so on and so forth. Well, there are actually many examples. I think we don't have so much time.
Then after that localization, matter in this case, we're talking about comic translation.
Localization, well, of course, since localization is adapting the comic to the target culture, right? Of course it matters. Because you cannot just translate, but you must always take into consideration someone's preferences. Well, it tells the story that maybe could teach you something about life in some cases, but in other cases it is just a type of entertainment. There is one more very, very important thing about comics translation. It is about fonts and cleanup. So when you translate comics, you must consider that usually even the original comic includes different ways of transferring or conveying feelings, tones, actions. So it means that the text and the speech bubbles are integrated into the comic, and sometimes the fonts are changed when a person is shocked. Sometimes the speech bubble looks differently because of a certain emotion that is, conveyed. And sometimes also actions are mentioned. And onomatopoeia. It is about conveying sounds and utterances. Sometimes, these are environmental sounds, and sometimes like verbal utterances, like someone's words. I will also show you some examples. These are maybe not the best examples, but the ones that I could find yesterday. Like, for example, the words jump and here and splash. Maybe it does not mean that much in English. Like bounce, and here we go grunting, and this is like the sound that the pig makes. And I really like the work of this translation team. This is the translation of a Korean comic into Russian, but really the graphics, like, it's very good. So here we can also see the font changed when the person is shocked, and different words, not even typed, but probably drawn here. Like, it's not actually easy. And just like here, like, they managed to convey exactly the emotions that are in the words. Yes. And this is probably one of the best examples, like when they're blushing, for example. Yes, there are also some culture-specific items, and there is a controversy as to whether we should preserve them or whether we should change them. So sometimes when we change different things, it might mean that we don't respect the author. Who knows? Yes, the universal approach, this is my conclusion. So usually when we translate comics, a universal approach must be found. And this means that the person translating it must have a very good knowledge of the source language, of the target language, and he or she must try to fit into the given space and cope with the limits and restrictions of the speech bubbles, and sometimes delete some words. Also, that person must know a lot about translation techniques in order to, for example, use the sentence partition or some antonymic translation and other techniques. And also, meaning. Preserving the meaning is also important, but not always possible.